Hola, my name is Miguel Romero, although most people in the Fortean Online community know me better as Red Pill Junkie, which is a moniker I've been using since at least 2007. Way before the term red pill was compromised by a bunch of misogynistic assholes, I might add. Thanks a lot, pendejos. And I kept using it when I became a news admin and writer for the Daily Grail, one of the most prestigious and oldest running news websites dealing with paranormal content. Red Pill Junkie also became the nom de plume I use when I signed the articles or essays I wrote for other websites, like Mysterious Universe, or in the anthology UFOs Reframing the Debate, which was edited by the late Robbie Graham. By the way, the cover of that book was among the first I was commissioned to create, as I have slowly tried to combine my two passions for both the paranormal and art in order to reinvent myself out of necessity, I might add, and slowly build a second career as a graphic designer and illustrator, the fruits of which you can find on my personal website, Absurd by Design. But in this video, I want to talk about what I feel has the greatest chance of becoming my biggest contribution and lasting legacy to the Fortean world, specifically to the field of ufology, which, by the way, I don't see anyone changing the name to UApology or UAP Studies, even though there seems to be like a big push to sweep the old acronym under the rug for the supposed embarrassing stigma it is mired with. Well, I, for one, still like using the old term UFO, thank you very much. And the history of UFOs, with all the colorful characters who have come and gone trying to make sense of them, is not something that I found embarrassing, but fascinating. Which is why today I want to talk to you about the Ufology Tarot. So many people by now probably know that the Ufology Tarot was a collective endeavor, but I don't think too many people are aware of how the project really started. For that, we need to go back all the way to 2016, right after the completion of UFOs Reframing the Debate, when my friend and mentor Greg Bishop, who is the author of several important books in the field, such as Project Beta, A is for Adamski, and It Defies Language, had the idea of organizing a small group of like minded colleagues, some of which also collaborated in Robbie's anthology, which he decided to call the Right Brain Project. Like the name suggests, everybody in the group shared a common distaste for the current rationalistic or left brain approach predominant in the field of UFO research, with an overemphasis to understand the phenomenon solely through a scientifically oriented lens and trying to simplify and strip away reports from any type of emotion or subjective content experienced by the witnesses, whom we all thought were the most important component of a UFO event. The character of police detective Joe Friday saying, "Just the facts, ma'am," perfectly illustrates the attitude of major UFO research groups like MUFON, who have been trained for decades to make the phenomenon conform to their tiny, easy to digest assumptions and make it fit into a clean analytical database. Greg and the group, on the other hand, felt that UFO events are anything but clean and analytical. They are messy, they are absurd, and they often leave the witnesses with lasting emotional and psychological impressions, and not always for the better. Greg has often said that if there was someone capable of changing the life of people in such a deep, lasting, and immediate way as a UFO close encounter often does, they will be considered the best artist in the world. It also bears mentioning that another common theme between UFOs and art, as explored in the writings by both Greg Bishop and also Paul Kimball, is that you can get divergently different impressions from separate observers subjected to the same experience. Just like five different persons standing in front of a Jackson Pollock painting will probably form five totally different opinions of it, it might evoke feelings of nostalgia in one individual, sexual arousal or sadness in another, while others might just scoff at it and say something like, meh, my 3-year-old could paint that. Likewise, witnesses in close proximity to a UFO might end up getting very different reactions during and after the event. The famous Marian apparitions of Fatima in 1917, observed by thousands of independent witnesses and still considered a true miracle by the Catholic Church, is a perfect example of this. With that in mind, our group sought out to explore right brain approaches to the UFO problem. The first project we embarked on was something we called under many names: the oblique theory cards, the disruptor cards, or the dilemma cards for researchers of unscheduled subjects. Yeah, it's a mouthful, I know. These were inspired by Brian Eno's oblique strategy cards, which are meant to promote creativity and help artists to break free of any mental blocks. In our case, the objective was to help researchers surpass any entrenched ideas they might have on their particular study subject, say UFOs, ghosts, or cryptozoology, by helping them observe the topic from an oblique perspective. Hence, we had cards that read things like: Imagine a series of events in the future that create this moment. Imagine you are another form of life, earthly or otherwise, and how it would react to the situation. Use the opinions of people who have no interest in your work. Or even, maybe you are crazy. As part of the group, I not only helped to come up with some of the messages in the cards, but I also designed the symbol that was to be printed on the back of these, which was partly inspired in the concept of asemic writing and the studies of the late Mario Pasaglini in so called alien languages. Asemic writing, for those unfamiliar with the concept, are meant to be forms of communication that are devoid of any given meaning, leaving the observer free to fill that void with their own subjective interpretation. My own asemic symbol was meant to convey something that came out of the simplest notion, a dot, that extends to form into a line, changes again to introduce a new dimension, and keeps progressing in complexity until it turns into a spiral. And from there, it will branch out into a sort of infinitesimal infinitude. See, that's the problem of trying to explain your artwork with words, because you fall into the temptation of using highfalutin bullshit so people will take you seriously. After the disruptor cards were completed, some people left the original group and others joined in, leaving us with five members: Greg, Susan Demeter, Joshua Cutchin, David Metcalf, and myself. Aside from regular salons via Skype, in which we chatted and discussed the latest bits of gossip making the rounds in UFO circles, and after the 2017 bombshell dropped by Leslie Keane and Ralph Blumenthal in the New York Times, there was plenty to talk about. We kept trying to come up with concrete right brain exercises. We tried, for example, the exquisite corpse method, which is a technique originally created by surrealist artist Andrea Breton, but without much success. And we also tried to come up with examples of symbols that were meant to convey the obliqueness of the UFO mystery. But since not all of the members were visually oriented, despite all of us being creative individuals, these exercises never really amounted to anything. We were starting to lose motivation, and perhaps fearing that the group would disband, it was then that Greg decided to share with us this crazy idea he had been toying with for years, sort of like his own version of fantasy baseball league. A tarot deck inspired by the famous Rider Waite Smith cards, which are the most popular and the most easily recognizable by lay people, that would replace the traditional imagery of the cards with characters and elements taken from the history of ufology, particularly from the most illustrious researchers in the field, whom all of us regarded as our personal heroes. When Greg made this suggestion, everyone was like, wow! Reacting with immediate enthusiasm and excitement. Well, everyone but me. Because after thinking about it quietly for a few seconds, I said to myself, "Fuck." And that's because, being the quote unquote artist in the group, that I fear that the brunt of the project will fall solely on my shoulders. And don't let me give the wrong impression. It's not as if the UFO Tarot Project didn't appeal to me in a variety of ways. Like, on the one hand, it was an opportunity to come up with something truly original and one of a kind that nobody had ever done before in the field. By this, I don't mean that there weren't already other tarot decks out there based on UFO imagery, but those didn't really try to do that. What we were planning, which was to use each card not only to give our own subjective interpretation about the UFO phenomenon in general and famous UFO events in particular, but also to tell a very rich history of each of the individuals that will be portrayed in the cards through their symbolism. As Greg wrote in the script of the video we released for the Kickstarter campaign, the Ufology Tarot will be the first UFO book intended to work directly with the subconscious of its readers. The second thing that appealed to me about the project is that for years I had been feeling the pressure that I needed to leave my mark in the field. You know how it is. Once you achieve a certain level of notoriety, sooner or later someone comes and asks, "So, RPJ, when are you going to write a book, huh?" Because apparently having your name printed on the cover of a hardcover or a paperback is the only way in which you can graduate from regular dude who knows a lot about flying saucers to Mr. Ufologist, whose opinions about UFOs are far more important than those of the common man. And it's not that I wouldn't like to write a book, but the problem is that always when I found myself with a semi interesting idea about UFOs, sooner or later I found that someone somewhere already wrote about it in the 1960s or the 1970s. So then I thought that the way I could distinguish myself from others was by combining not only my writing skills but my drawing skills. Already I was deeply immersed in the reading of Jacques Vallée's printed journals Forbidden Science and was fantasizing about making a graphic novel about Vallée's early years. But at the same time, I was daunted by the fact that I lacked the experience to pull off a project of that magnitude, and that, as any serious comic book artist will tell you, creating a graphic novel all by yourself takes a really, really fucking long time. So now let's jump back to the Skype salon with Greg suggesting his idea to the group. And as I was listening to him, I was thinking to myself that a tarot deck was kind of like a graphic novel, but without the problems of continuity and lettering. Maybe this was the way that I could leave my mark. But still, I was hesitant. Could I pull this off? Remember when I said right at the beginning that I created my website Absurd by Design out of necessity? Well, that was because I wasn't really formally trained as an artist. I studied industrial design in college, and for 20 years I worked in architecture projects until several circumstances made finding a job in that field virtually impossible for me. In short, I was doubting that I had the chops for the task, but feeling a bit of group pressure, I told the guys, look, I will draw one card, and if it comes out terrible, we'll just forget all about it. They all agreed, so we chose the magician for this prototype test. And of course, we could think of no better UFO personality for that card other than Jacques Vallée. Like, duh. The process of creating the card first involved replacing the imagery found in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and updating it with elements that fit the biography of our magician. I asked one of my nephews to pose for me using a plant holder tube of mine and an old floppy disk I found in my dad's home office. These were meant to symbolize not only the as above, so below pose from the original card, but also Vallée's career, which began first as an astronomer and later as a computer scientist. Above him, I decided to put a flying sail ship riding a black cloud as a reference to Vallée's most famous book, Passport to Magonia. On the table next to the magician, we observe a beaker and a burner, which are a reference not only to Vallée's lifelong interest in alchemy, but also to his later work involving the analysis of purported metal samples obtained from UFOs, the so-called metamaterials. We also see a stone slab with an inscription of the famous Roman magic square, Sator, Opera, Tenet, Arepo, Rotas, which again I found that Ballet was fascinated with it through his Forbidden Science journals. There are also some center cards, which symbolize his involvement with SRI and the remote viewing program in the 1960s. And under the table, I couldn't resist introducing a mischievous looking imp, who is not only another reference to Passport to Magonia and Vallee's interest in connecting the modern UFO mythos with ancient legends about fairies, but it is also a subtle homage to Aimé Michel, the famous French ufologist and one of Vallee's early mentors. Finally, on the right lower corner, we see a spider web with a bunch of Rosicrucian symbols embedded in it. This was my way to symbolize Vallee's contribution to ARPANET, the early precursor to our modern internet, as well as his personal connection to Rosicrucianism, something I cannot get into in this video, but for which I strongly recommend viewers to read the first two volumes of Forbidden Science, so you can get a sense of Vallee's personal mysticism. One of the things I was most concerned about was creating the card in such a way as to give it a very distinctive and refined look. As I already stated, I was not trained formally as an artist, and as such, I never managed to develop an original art style of my own, which can be both limiting and liberating for a designer depending on a given assignment. For this project, I wanted to base the style on the artwork of ancient masters like Albrecht Dürer or Gustave Doré, so they would look somewhat timeless and anachronistic, while at the same time using techniques like half-tone textures to endow them with a more modern look, inspired by my love of pop culture and Japanese manga. Like in manga, I also wanted to employ a very limited palette of colors to give my cards a very refined appearance, while also giving us the chance of using screen printing if we so chose it. I wanted everything in shades of gray, but I also wanted to emphasize a few particular elements within the composition with a bright red color to direct the attention to the viewer and emphasize their importance. This decision was received with some resistance by the group in the beginning, and at the end of the day, I acquiesced to David's suggestion to also include a blue color to the palette, which in the end turned out to be a very good idea, as the combination of red, blue, gray, black, and white allowed me to play around with the halftones and combine them to create other tones, like in Betty Hill's dress in the Lover's Card, which is a direct reference to the exact same dress she was wearing during their famous abduction. Once I finished the Magician card and concluded that I didn't entirely hate it and was received with unanimous enthusiasm by the rest of the group, my reticence was somewhat broken and I was like, fine, I'll do this shit. After all, how hard could it be, right? Right? So during the period of 2019 to 2020, the group kept with our regular Sunday salons, discussing the potential candidates of each card, the pros and cons, etc. Well, I tried my best to use any free time and off weekend I had available to draw the cards and design the layouts for the front and the back. Very briefly, I just want to mention these designs were meant to be very geometric and were loosely inspired by crop circle designs. People have particularly commended me for the design on the back of the cards, which, as anyone with an interest in sacred geometry would notice, is meant to represent the ancient Vesica Pisces, which is a very powerful sacred symbol. The red eye at the center was kind of a last minute addition that turned out to be a great idea in retrospect. So that was the plan, and you know what they say. You wanna make God laugh? Tell him your plans. The problem was that by this time in my career, I was making most of my living as a freelance designer. And as any colleague will know, freelance and free time are just terms that don't really mix. Hence, by 2020, I had only managed to complete only two more cards: The Emperor, featuring J. Allen Hynek, and The Lovers, featuring Betty and Barney Hill. Very briefly, and without getting into the weeds of each, I just want to point you to the orb held in the hands of our emperor, which is, of course, a reference to the famous Socorro case he investigated while he was still attached to Project Blue Book. On the lover's card, one of the most obscure references are the flames hanging from the Tree of Life next to Barney, which is the symbol representing the Unitarian Church to which Betty and he were members of. Like I said, one of our main goals with the cards was to populate them with a lot of subtle references to the lives and careers of the figures chosen to appear on them, which in turn made the process of creating them extremely slow, to say the least, because it wasn't just a matter of drawing the damn things. Each card required extensive amount of research and the seeking of good images references, which often were very hard to find online. So, with only 3 cards done and 75 more cards left to complete a full tarot deck, I had no choice but to put my foot down and tell the guys, look, this thing ain't gonna work. If we all want to see this project finish within our natural lifetimes, we need to find a way for me to work in this full time instead of just my weekends or whatever free hour I have available. Greg, being the leader of the group, at first offered me to pay for my work out of his own pocket, something which I declined for 2 reasons. The first is was that I didn't want to give up the rights to the cards. Like, I have worked all my professional life designing things that end up being owned by somebody else. Like I said, this I felt that this project was my chance of leaving my mark. And number two, because I felt that if the cards turn out to be something so quirky and peculiar that they will only be of interest to Greg, who first imagined them, and the members of the right brain group, who were all very like minded individuals, then I thought, what was the fucking point? I feared it will be like telling a joke that is so obscure that only you get to laugh with the punchline. So I wanted to see if there were other people outside our little group who will find interest in something so niche as the ufology tarot deck, which is why we came up deciding that a crowdsourcing campaign was our best course of action. The basics of how we will deal with the campaign were laid out like this. The first important decision we took is that we will only commit to create the 22 cards of the major arcana, and the rest will be left for a possible second campaign depending on how successful the first turned out. Greg would be in charge of calculating the cost of making the cards, which included my fees, along with other material we will be offering to the backers. And once completed, he will supervise the printing and the shipping in Los Angeles. We all wanted to have a nice coffee table book explaining the symbology behind the cards, and later Josh was in charge of editing the chapters of that book, which will be divided and written by all the members of the group. Susan, for example, was in charge of writing the chapter explaining the history of the tarot. Josh was also responsible for designing the layout, which I think everyone can agree he did an excellent job with it. A teaser video was being prepared by Greg, and while he reached out to both Jacques Vallée and Whitley Strieber to get blurbs from them, I, on the other hand, contacted other personalities in the field like John L. Tenney, Michael N. Hughes, and Greg Newkirk, who also provided us with nice quotes we added to the video. Greg Newkirk, by the way, became one of the 3 top tier backers in the campaign, and I want to take this chance once again to thank him and his wife Dana for all their amazing support. Same goes for Lauren Coleman and my friend Saxon, also known as Super Inframan among listeners of the podcast Where Did the Road Go? Thank you so much, guys, once again. We arranged to launch the campaign by Halloween of 2021, and we decided that we needed at least 4 cards as proof of concept to show to the backers. Like I said, I already had drawn 3. So for the fourth one, I chose to create Strength, which features the late Anne Droffel and arch-skeptic Philip Klass dressed as the cowardly lion from The Wizard of Oz, as suggested by Greg. Originally, I was going to substitute the lion with something like a black panther or a black hound, which are so common in fortune accounts. But introducing class worked so well in many levels, since he's not only there to symbolize the opposing force in ufology, but also because during her lifetime, Droffel butted heads with him more than a few times, and it seems class actually developed a rare sense of respect towards her, something that he certainly didn't show to others in the field. Class, by the way, ended up becoming the main avatar of skepticism in the whole project, because I ended up representing him not only as the main figure in the Devil card, but he's also indirectly represented in the Hangman, with the figure of a buzzard looking down upon James MacDonald, whose life he helped ruin when he launched a very nasty campaign seeking to discredit him. It was Susan the first to point out that these three cards, Strength, the Handman, and the Devil, ended up with a connecting narrative. There are at least two other cards that are connected by a shared symbology, but I'll leave you to figure out which these are. While preparations for the campaign were ongoing, I decided to go the extra mile and draw a fifth card, the Fool, featuring Whitley Strieber, which is definitely one of my favorite cards in the whole deck. The Fool, for people who might not know too much about tarot, is not meant to be a symbol of ridicule. It was not our intention to mock Whitley in any way. In fact, he himself chose that card for him when Greg talked to him. And once he did, we all thought it was perfect, because the Fool is meant to represent the beginning of a spiritual journey, a quest for knowledge which will always begin in ignorance. And most of us who've read Whitley's books, particularly Communion and Transformation, regardless of whether you believe he's accurately describing or not the events that happened at that cabin in upstate New York to him, his family, and even to his cats, who are also depicted in the cards, we can recognize that at the core of his writing is a man struggling with uncertainty as he's trying to find his path toward the answers he is seeking. To conclude the history of the campaign, and to our collective surprise, and despite how little publicity it got online, it still managed to be pretty successful. So now it was my time to put up or shut up. So from November of 2021 to November of 2022, my sole professional occupation was in making the cards, aside from my duties to the Daily Grail, that is. And to fulfill the deadline, I knew that I had to complete at least two cards per month, which may not sound like much until you actually manage to see all the shit ton of detail I put into each of them. There were times when I was even told by other members that I was putting too much detail, which wouldn't even show up on the final size of the cards. But deep down, I didn't care, because I knew that even if those elements would be lost in the cards, they will still be appreciated in the book we were preparing, or in the large 11 by 17 posters. And I'm not just talking about the symbology we got to discuss and agree upon during the salons, but also hidden Easter eggs that I decided to include without telling anyone. This was, after all, a magical work, and as everyone knows, the more secrets there are, the more potent the magic. For example, in the Sun card, designed to be a homage to both the Fatima apparitions and the famous Argentinian case involving the young boy Juan Perez, which was the subject of a wonderful documentary, Witness of Another World, I secretly put the letters VT next to the entity Juan observed inside the craft, as a reference to Venado Tuerto, the place where the close encounter allegedly took place. So I really don't know how many hours I put into this project, because it never really occurred to me to clock myself. But considering I rarely took days off, except on rare occasions that were outside my control, which I will get into, I estimate I easily devoted way over 1,400 hours of work to complete the project in that year. And that doesn't even include the time it took to complete the first proof of concept cards, the layout design, the book cover, the eventual modifications and corrections, the extra commissions promised to the top tier backers, or the many salon sessions we kept having Sundays or Wednesdays to discuss their content. As for the process itself, since I'm being credited as the artist in the project, I wanted to leave perfectly clear what it actually entailed. Like I said, during the group salons, we all extensively discussed the cards using Susan's expertise in the symbolism of the tarot, along with Greg and the others' extensive knowledge in the history of ufology. These brainstorming sessions helped us establish the major aspects of the composition and sparked my imagination. And I ended up using the sessions minutes, which Greg wrote at the end of each one, as a roadmap that will allow me to navigate the terrain of the cards, as it were. But How that terrain was approached and what ended up being inside the cards was up to me. When I showed early sketches to the group during the salons, they would sometimes make slight suggestions, which I often took into consideration. These suggestions proved to be invaluable and enriched the symbolism of the cards in ways I doubt I would have accomplished by myself alone. Like when Greg suggested I should add an owl flying over Whitley's cabin in the Fool card, which greatly improved the composition. Or when Josh suggested I use the algol symbol in the Wheel of Fortune to replace the devil that is found in the original Rider Waite Smith deck. The algol being a reference not only to the demon star in astrology, but also to the algorithm in the modern world, which is responsible in large part to the cycle of news content we get bombarded with in this modern age of social media. The Wheel of Fortune was incidentally one of the compositions that took longer to pin down, going through several tentative concepts until we finally agreed the card will be designed to represent the cyclical nature of UFO narratives. Starting with a space brother on the upper left representing contacteeism, the reinterpretation of ancient myths through the lens of the ancient aliens hypothesis on the top right, and finishing with the prevalent mythologies of crash disk retrievals and the involvement of the military in modern UFO conspiracies. At the center, I chose to create a wheel within wheel, which is one of the ways in which angels are represented in biblical accounts. By now, you may be getting an inkling of why some cards were definitely easier than others to conceive. The magician, the emperor, the hermit. These had candidates Greg had already come up with on his own years ago, and we all thought they were perfect, so it was all a matter of enriching them with symbolism. Other cards had more than one candidate, however, so it became a matter of discussing among ourselves the merits of each one and whether the person or persons chosen could be made to fit into a certain narrative. Like, for instance, the Chariot card, in which we ended up portraying three of the main figures in abduction research: John Mack, Bud Hopkins, and Leo Sprinkle. Leo, the Wyoming cowboy riding the white horse, was more aligned to the love and light interpretations of the abduction phenomenon, while Bud, the city painter riding the black horse, was more prone to view abductions in a more negative light. John Mack, dressed as Lawrence of Arabia, is shown on top of the Western style stagecoach meant to represent the overemphasis of abductions in the United States and other Western countries, acts almost as the balancing force of this triad in the composition. But the cards that were more abstract in meaning proved to be much more elusive, and we kept postponing the resolution, like the Death card, which I ended up deliberately leaving it to be the last card to draw, partly as a joke, and partly because for a long time I thought it would be the hardest one to complete. It wasn't, by the way. And a couple of cards in the end were largely up to me to conceive once we found ourselves out of good ideas for them collectively. Like, for example, The World, which I took as an opportunity to go beyond the US centric focus of the cards. On the top left of that card, I put Pedro Ferriz, the godfather of Mexican mythology and one of the figures who are the most responsible for me being here recording this video for you right now. To the top right is Antonio Rivera, one of the pillars of ufology in Spain. And below them we see Kinichi Arai and Andrew Thomas, pioneers of the field in both Japan and Australia respectively. I will talk some more about this card later on. Professor Jeffrey Kripal, who was gracious enough to write the foreword for our tarot book, engages in The Supernatural, a book he co-authored with Whitley Strieber in 2016, with the problem of trying to come to terms with the term hermeneutics. In its simplest definition, hermeneutics is the art and practice of deciphering meaning or message, which might not sound too exciting to those of us who are not undergrads studying some course in the humanities, but in the supernatural, Kripal help us to understand, in layman terms, how there is truly an alchemical process bonding the act of interpretation of a sacred meaning and the person engaging in that very interpreting. Not unlike the entanglement between two separate particles, which has confounded several generations of modern physicists trying to wrap their heads around the absurdity of quantum mechanics. In Chapter 7, What Evolution Looks Like, Kripal uses as an allegory the image of a two-way mirror to illustrate his thesis, explaining that by trying to come up with terms and interpret the unknowable, what is on the other side of a two-way mirror, the interpreter standing on this side of the mirror is observing a projection of themselves in the form of their own imagination, filling that unknowable gap. Thus, when the individual goes further and comes to recognize that these interpretations are both reflections of something real and human creations, that one is being interpreted as one interprets, being seen as one sees, then we call this paradoxical practice hermeneutics. So, in other words, the way that I understand this mindfuck anyway is not so much that the abyss ends up looking back at you like Nietzsche warned us, but the act of staring at the abyss, of facing it long enough, will inevitably transform you. And the abyss, in a way, will become part of you, whether you like it or not. This process of hermeneutics, as I came to understand in retrospect, was the true essence behind the Ufology Tarot Project. By featuring these illustrious figures in the history of ufology within our cards, we were not only paying respect to their contributions, for better or worse, to the collective attempt to understand the nature of the UFO phenomenon. We were also paying homage to how the very act of seeking those answers had irrevocably changed them. Perhaps no better example of this can be found than in the card The Handman, which we have already mentioned, featuring James MacDonald, who undoubtedly paid a steeper price than most for his vocal interest in the phenomenon. As it can be appreciated in the card, MacDonald is hanging from a saguaro tree, like the ones you will find in the region of Arizona where he committed suicide in 1971, and below him to his right there is a revolver, like the one he might have used to end his own life, as well as a copy of the Condon Report, the coup de grace which relegated the field of ufology to the pages of tabloids and late night radio shows for decades to come. So the cards were a homage to the hermeneutics of ufology. That I could understand on an intellectual level. What I fail to anticipate, though, is that hermeneutics is like a knife that cuts both ways. And the act of creating the cards will also transform me as well. And not just the act of forcing me to elevate my artwork and artistic skills to meet the challenge of the project and materialize the images in my mind to the best of my abilities. I'm also talking about continuous and notorious intrusions into my daily life that further confirm to me we were, in fact, in the middle of performing a magical work. It was not long after the main production of the project started in 2021 that I began to notice really curious synchronicities attached to the cards. The first among them was when I completed the Hermit card, featuring none other than John Keel. As you might have guessed by now, even though I haven't really made it clear enough in this presentation, the production of the cards followed no particular order outside of whatever tickled my fancy. And I was particularly interested in the Hermit card not only because of my personal admiration to Keel, but also because I was very determined to populate that card with symbols that would reference his most famous writings, namely Operation Trojan Horse, the Mothman Prophecies, and the Eighth Tower. Well, it was just after I finished that card that I realized I had completed it on the exact anniversary of the Silver Bridge collapse in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, on December 15th, 1967. Again, this is not something I consciously planned, it simply happened organically. Another major synchronicity happened around the time I told the group I was planning on making the World card next. As I mentioned earlier, I intended this card to be a homage to notable ufologists outside the United States, but I was also planning to use it as an opportunity to symbolize the Gaia theory and its possible connection to the UFO mystery. It was then that Susan mentioned to us that James Lovelock, the scientist who coined the term Gaia theory, had just passed away. Needless to say, we were all rather shocked by the coincidence. Not all synchronicities were nice, though. Remember when I said I deliberately decided to leave the death card for last in the project? After much deliberation, I had finally decided to solve the composition by replacing the Black Knight in the Raider Waite Smith deck with a very tall and ghoul like man in black riding Snippy the horse, the first documented case of cattle mutilation in modern history. The characteristics of this MIV were in fact influenced by the reading of a passage on one of Raymond Fowler's books, where he describes an encounter Betty Andreasson, who is featured in the card next to her daughter and Albert K. Bender, allegedly had with an entity similar to what I drew. I distinctly remember the night I finished inking the macabre face of my MIB. It was late, and after many hours of work, I was ready to go to bed, feeling very proud of myself and how scary looking my artwork had turned out. As I entered my bedroom and closed the curtains of my window, I almost jumped when I noticed a huge spider on the wall next to the curtains. It was almost as if someone wanted to take my pride down a couple of notches by showing me what real fear is all about. But my most powerful synchronicity happened by the time I finished the Devil card, with our old pal Philip Glass flanked by Butthead Carl Sagan and crew cut Edward Condon. I had a disagreement with Greg over the placement of the cryptic legend in Latin I decided to include in it. The legend, Vivas in Incerto, was my way to symbolize Classell's famous course to ufologists, which reads, no matter how long you live, you will never know any more about UFOs than you know today. You will never know any more about what UFOs really are or where they come from. You will never know any more about what the US government really knows about UFOs than you know today. As you lie on your own deathbed, you will be as mystified about UFOs as you are today. And you will remember this curse. The disagreement with Greg angered me, not only because I didn't want to change something I had considered finished and done, but also because back in those days I was going through the worst time in my life. My mother was hospitalized due to COVID, and my whole family was distraught over the emotional roller coaster we were submitted by the encouraging news of improvement we were getting from the medical staff in the mornings, followed in the evenings by alerts that my mom's condition had turned critical. For viewers who might have gone through something similar back in those days, there's no need to explain how horrible this was. You have the person you care the most in the world connected to a fucking machine, and you cannot even be there in the same room with her due to the sanitary restrictions. It was hell. So I wasn't on a good headspace when I finally changed the placement of the damn Latin text on the card. And when I sent it to the group, I asked them to leave me alone for a while. It was no long after that we received news that my mother had passed away. Shit got really dark, eh? Sorry. Look, I'm not sharing all this personal drama to gain any sympathies or to show how many sacrifices I made for this project. No, I thought it was important to bring it up because thinking about all of this more than 18 months after my mom passed, I began to wonder, with my insistence on that Latin text on that card, I began to wonder if I had inadvertently cursed myself with this project. You know, like Grant Morrison, when he was writing The Invisibles and he almost died of some weird bacterial infection. You can look that story online if you don't know it. By this, I don't mean to say that I think I cast a spell that killed my mother. No, no, what I'm thinking is more in terms of the classes course. And because of the thing I have yearned the most all this time since my mom died was having some sort of confirmation that she's still around in some form. That all that shit I've read about afterlife communications and near death experiences and all that is true. And that someday we will be together again. Unfortunately, that has not come to pass, at least not the way that I wanted. And instead of having some sort of confirmation, I'm living in uncertainty. Viva sin incerto. Fuck you, Philip Glass. And yet, I also know that the reason I wanted to include that damn Latin legend in the first place was because of our beloved fool, Whitley Strieber. Because the message of communion is all about embracing uncertainty and using it as a tool for growth. Are the visitors extraterrestrials? Manifestations of the collective unconscious? An aspect of humanity as different from us as a butterfly is different from a caterpillar? We just don't know. The same way we don't know with certainty if consciousness survives physical death. And that's okay because the uncertainty allows us to keep on our path for answers. As Voltaire once wrote, doubt is not a pleasant condition, but certainty is absurd. More absurd, perhaps, than the absurdity reflected by the UFO mystery. I finished the artwork within 1 or 2 weeks of the deadline I had set to myself in fall of 2022, followed by the long process of making final reviews to all the material. And in April of this year, I traveled to the United States to sign the hundreds of boxes, books, and posters that were sent to our backers sometime later. That trip to California was also an opportunity to charge the cards by taking them to relevant places in the history of ufology, namely Giant Rock and the Integratron, which happens to be featured in the Star card, the one devoted up to the old contactees of the 1950s and 60s. Spending so much time and energy devoted to a single project will always leave you with mixed feelings. I've been thinking and working around the Ufology Tarot Project for 5 years now. And during that time, they became my children, my lovers, my refuge, my tormentors, my confidants, my disappointment, and also my anchor when my whole world turned upside down when my mother was taken from us. Did I succeed in making my mark and leaving a legacy that will preserve my memory after I'm gone? Chances are the deck might end up like one of those forgotten paperbacks published in the 60s and 70s, written by authors nobody reads anymore. I truly don't know, and at this point in my life, I really don't care that much. Viva sin incerto. It's kind of liberating if you manage to get the hang of it. So, on second thought, thanks a lot, Phil. Now, what I do wonder about now that they are finally released into the world is how this little experiment by the right brain group will be received by the people they might come in contact with. Some might just see them as a weird curiosity, others as an encoded history of the UFO world and the people who have inhabited it. And there might be even others who will be willing to use the cards as a source of inspiration or even divination. Sure, part of me would like to think that my artwork is so potent it might allow someone somewhere to summon a freaking flying saucer, but things just don't work that way. Like, it's just not in the cards. No, what I am actually hoping for, and what I suspect has a higher chance of taking place instead of the opening of a magical portal at Skinwalker Ranch, is that there will be a few individuals who will approach the ufology tarot with the right kind of open minded attitude. And just like Jeffrey Kripal's two way mirror, by looking into the cards, they will manage to get a fleeting glimpse of their true selves. Thank you for watching, and remember, enjoy your uncertainty.